Hi, I'm John DeArmond of the Coquille Valley Sword Group, and today we're talking about Article 15. So, let's dive in. Article 15. The body as representative of the sword. The body as representative of the sword describes the basic principle that, when attacking, you should not apply the sword and the body simultaneously against the opponent. To strike, the already prepared body usually advances as representative of the sword, and after this, the actual stroke of the sword follows. This strike should be carried out with the free spirit of the void. The sword, the body, and the spirit do not advance simultaneously. You should consider a spirit held back inside when striking, a body also held back inside. These relationships should be carefully observed. So, what this article is basically the order of operations of what in Hyoho we consider to be our standard mode of attacking. Now, you'll notice that he does leave some space here in saying that this is usually how things go down, because obviously in fighting, it's more important to adapt to your situation than adhere to your dogma, as a general rule. So, what are we talking about here? It's pretty simple, right? What we need to do is we have these three factors that work against our opponent. First is our body, and we mean by this our physical body's location in relation to our opponent, whether we are close to them, whether we are far, how we are angled to them, right? The second is the sword itself, the tool as it's moving through the air into the target, and kind of all the in-between stages. The third is our spirit. The spirit here is a large blanket term for several smaller ideas. Not necessarily smaller, but it encapsulates several other ideas, right? This includes our spirit of intention, right? What we are trying to accomplish and how we sort of broadcast that to the opponent. It includes our spirit of appearance, right? How we want the opponent to interpret our body's motion, our actions, our internal drive that they cannot readily see by just observing the motion. The third is our seme, right? Which is kind of, it's very similar to the other two types of spirit, but it is more, it's more in line with physical body action, right? So that is to say, it is generated through physical body motion. It is perceived through the quality of physical motion. Anyway, we've talked a lot about seme and ino kokoro and shin no kokoro, so you should you at least have a foothold of understanding here. So these three things: body, sword, spirit. What order do they typically move in? If we are making a very standard attack, right, we will move our body into position first. Boop. We'll swing the sword freely, and our spirit is not revealed to the opponent typically, right? So, what does this look like? Well, you already know what it looks like. because you know the Hasokatas, right? We step, we avoid their attack, step into our position, right? Then we swing, right? So this is not to say that your swing doesn't necessarily involve the motion of the body, right? Because in fact it has to, right? The sword is not going to, you're not just sitting here and the sword just swings itself. Your body has to move to swing the sword. What we're talking about is the gross locomotion necessary to bring your sword into reasonable striking distance, rather than the refined body motion that's used to generate the cutting force and make minor adjustments to the distance, right? So Musashi says, don't use it all together, right? Now this is what it's one of the two ways that beginners typically tend to move. Either they will forget their body altogether and just swing their sword, especially if you bait them into it. And they go into this sort of lightsaber fighting where they're hitting at your sword but not really cutting at you. They're not building their progression. They're not improving their position at all, and so it's easy to take them, right? The other way, the way that we're more concerned about avoiding right now, is this I run in and swing at you at the same time. Right? Well, why is this a bad thing? It's a good question, right? The easiest way to think of it is that we need to allow for enough time for things to develop and mature. Not just our own strike, right? But the opponent's position as well. And this can seem a little bit more of a mind game than it actually is. Basically, if we try and orient our body towards moving to where we want in a way that's efficient, possibly dodging or moving out of the way of their work so that we're not stopped by it, that is a complex motion, and it's complex enough without us adding sort of another layer of motion to that. By segmenting our motions of attack, we allow for more precise targeting and the ability to use, or the ability to focus our body's work into the task at hand, to cut them intentionally, right? This is one of those things that even at kind of an intermediate skill level, it can be difficult to see the particular value of it. But once you have spent, 5-10 years at this, really let Kyoho's method your body, right? Then it's natural, right? And almost intuitively, you don't need to be told to do this. You do it because you're able to, with enough experience, recognize it as the most efficient way to resolve the situation, right? In the beginning, everybody thinks that speed is the key to victory, right? That if I cut you faster, I'll win, right? And it takes a lot of maturity to get over this idea. And it can be tricky, because as you progress, you start to see more and more often the case is not that the fastest sword wins, but rather the sword that waits wins. Now, this can seem quite contradictory to what we were talking about with like Ken no Sen initiative, to hit in that first time, and that we always want to be at the head of that. But it's contradictory in appearance only. And once you play with this and can let go of your terror for long enough to wait while someone's trying to murder you, then it'll become a lot more clear, and you can work and go, oh, right? Suddenly, the encounter that you felt was so chaotic and so fast, so just this sliver of just bluster and fury. You realize that it's not, and that in truth, it's happening quite slowly. Irregardless of the physical speed that people are trying to move at, the entire encounter is a fairly slow, and if you're in the right mindset, almost relaxed affair, right? And you begin to see the virtue in just giving it a moment, right? And this is connected with the idea of rhythm and fighting, and how to manipulate your opponent's rhythm, how to break their rhythm, and how to avoid being pulled into their rhythm, or giving their rhythm more power. So, for example, let's say we take ukenagashi. It's a very, very classic move found in many different koryu. Everyone has their own little sort of sub-flavors about how they make the parry, but the idea is simple. Dude swings at you, you make it like he's going to hit something, he hits next to nothing, and you hit him, right, in that Tai no Sen timing. Let's say that the opponent attacks, we ukenagashi, and we strike immediately, right? So, he goes, ba, we go ba, we go ba. We're in his rhythm. He just ukenagashis out of it, right? Just like you see in the Nagashi Uchikata, which hopefully we have out by now. If not, it's coming, I swear. We're just trying to match up schedules with Edward so we can see the kata with both sides. The reason that they can respond without thought in that same ukenagashi motion that they've practiced is because you responded in their rhythm, right? They set the rhythm, you responded, bump, and they work it, bah. But if we pause for just a moment so that they are forced out of their rhythm and they start to shift, right? They come from that cut, they go bump, you see them recognize what's going on, and they instinctively begin to move, you take them, right? And this little pause, right? This little, just taking a moment, will so drastically improve your ability to successfully cut your opponent. I mean, it's really remarkable, because once you are able to do this, once you can see it happen and you understand it and you've sort of calmed your heart down enough to work and wait and watch and work, you'll find that you can work at whatever speed you want, right? Or rather, you don't feel as though the opponent is driving you to work at a faster speed than you're comfortable at, right? So, now there are other benefits to this sort of order of operations. One is that it helps to encourage the generation of what we can think of as like a kinetic wave of force. In other words, I come, I step in, bump, 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 bump. Force is traveling from my feet up. I bring it up through the turn of the hips. I've got that little pause as it drains out through my arm, through the sword. This wave motion, boom, boom, generates an immense amount of power, which for us can be very beneficial since we're usually using the sword one-handed, right? And using the sword one-handed can create, or rather, if you were to use the sword one-handed in the same way that most styles use their sword two-handed, you would be at a stark disadvantage in terms of the physical speed that you can move, which is a product of the ease at which you can move, in the amount of power that you can generate, right? Suddenly, a cut that with two hands, even with light to no muscle, would easily cut cleanly. Doing it one-handed, your cut, it just does not cut well. It can cut shallowly. So, Hyoho, of course, makes up for this by fighting in a different way than most Koryu in regards to using the sword one-handed. And this wave motion is part of that. We talked about the timing benefits, so let's go ahead and move on a little bit. So, body moves and the sword cuts with the free spirit of the void. Now, this is something we've talked about a couple of times, but it's worth sort of reiterating. When you're swinging your sword, you are not, it is not as though you are using your hands to push through a hedge, right? You're not trying to drive through them. You're not using your muscles in this kind of pushing fashion. What you're doing is getting the sword where it needs to be in a manner that is in accord with its natural motion. In other words, I'm not using my muscles to force the sword to move in a way that is unnatural for it, right? But rather, I'm moving the sword and letting it travel as it wishes, right? With a lively hand. So that it generates the most amount of force, and force that's going to travel in a relative direction or vector that is useful for us, as opposed to one that, despite all of our effort, is not going to work out well. Stepping and then cutting helps us ease into this, right? Once, however, you get used to this just free cutting, not slashing, right? In other words, not just moving my sword through the general space of them and hitting something, right? But intentionally cutting, going, boom, right there, right? Right on the clavicle, right into the carotid, right into the brachial, whatever, right? It becomes much easier to cut. So, what else did he say? I'll move simultaneously. We already talked about that. The spirit held back inside when striking. We've talked about this briefly, but I don't think we're going to spend time right now to go over it further. What's important is understanding the sort of cyclical rhythm in this motion. Body, sword, spirit. Body, sword, spirit. Boom, boom, boom. Right? In the same way, you don't want it would be inconvenient to have all 4 seasons of the year in one day. You don't want to move with all 4 stages of your cycle at once. At this point, I feel I'm just kind of repeating myself, so we'll go ahead and cut it off here. As always, if you want to understand this work, you have to pick up a sword and go train.